Finding a starting point for this video has been one of the most difficult things I've ever done for this channel. This is made really awkward by the fact that one of the first things I figured out for this video was the first sentence. Pointing out the core problem of the God of High School's anime adaptation is very easy. The pacing is too fast. The reasoning behind why I had such a difficult time starting this video was because after having watched the anime, something didn't feel quite right to me. The 3 or 4 rewrites before this iteration failed to nail down exactly what that was, and it wasn't until I decided to read the original webtoon that I finally figured it out. There's something very wrong about the God of High School's anime adaptation. It's like the anime managed to figure out what made the original webtoon good at a surface level, but failed to see beyond that surface. Simply put, the adaptation is severely lacking compared to the original product. My parting words for anyone considering watching the anime would be to read the original webtoon instead. While the anime certainly has some visually stunning segments that deserve a lot of credit, outside of that, nothing the anime does improves upon the original and in many cases is a straight downgrade. If you've only seen the anime, then I also suggest reading the webtoon. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. We'll do the spoiler warning here before getting into the main bulk of the video. This video will contain spoilers for Season 1 of the God of High School's anime adaptation. It will also contain spoilers for the webtoon, but only within the first 2 arcs, since that's how much was adapted. Changing and skipping parts of the original source material is not an uncommon practice in the anime industry. You want to be able to tell a full story or a full arc within the confines of however many episodes you're given, and sometimes things need to be edited or cut out entirely to make sure everything fits within that time frame. The God of High School's anime adaptation went overboard with this and tried to cram too much into too few episodes. Even with all of the content that was changed or cut, that still wasn't enough as made visible by the anime's nightmarishly fast pacing. Most characters are boiled down to incredibly simple, one-dimensional caricatures, and a lot of bits and pieces to the story are glazed over and rushed through to make room for whatever was next in line. Even the action, which I think most people would say is the anime's best quality, doesn't escape the fast pacing for the most part. Some episodes have multiple fights jammed into them, which by itself isn't a problem, but when combined with the speed at which the other events within the final product occur at, it all contributes to the anime feeling like a disorganized and messy blur. 13 episodes certainly wasn't enough, and I think the anime would have greatly benefited from having anywhere from 24 to 26 episodes instead. All the events in the anime can be expanded a bit to make sure they feel more fleshed out, and the stuff that didn't make it from the original webtoon can be up for reconsideration, which brings me to the main point of this video. As I read the first 2 arcs of the webtoon, I noted down every instance of something that was changed or cut, and by my count I found a total of 57 things that were changed and 55 things that were skipped entirely. Funnily enough, if you combine those 2 numbers, you get 112, which is the exact number of chapters within the first 2 arcs. If you were to try counting the changes and cuts yourself, you may end up with either more or less than me depending on what you qualify as a change. Rather than trying to define what I see as a change, I think an example would be better and quicker. Let's use the fight between Mira and Misan as that example. This would be episode 3 in the anime or chapter 15 in the webtoon. Between the 2 versions there are different moves and the organization of the fight is also a little different. I did not count this as a change. However, while the result of the fight is the same across both versions, in the webtoon it's a forfeit caused by Misan not wanting to risk losing her arm, whereas in the anime, Misan is defeated by Mira. I counted this as a change. I hope that example was enough to establish a sort of baseline on what I did and did not count as a change. If that wasn't enough, then we still have plenty more to talk about, so hopefully it should become more clear as we go on. I'm not going to discuss every single change or cut between the 2 versions in this video because that would be too much to cover, says the guy who made an 80-fucking-minute video on Rent-A-Girlfriend, but that's an entirely different story. Rather, we'll go through some of the more important differences with a heavier emphasis on what the anime loses as a result of those changes. To catch everyone up to speed, if you haven't watched or read The God of High School, it is about a fighting tournament that takes place in South Korea. The winner of said tournament is granted one wish of their choice. The 2 arcs covered in the anime are the Seoul Preliminary Tournament and the National Tournament. There is also a power system known as charyuk or borrowed powers. To put it simply, these are abilities regular humans can obtain by communicating and borrowing powers from gods. These can manifest in various forms such as elemental abilities, enormous weapons, giant specters, and so on. And as you may have noticed 2 sentences ago, gods, plural, also exist within this universe and they mostly become relevant from the National Tournament arc onwards. Now that we've covered that, we'll actually get into those differences. Let's begin with the characters. I'll start by saying that I hate the anime's version of the main character, Jin Mori. In the anime, he boils down to mostly repeating the same lines over and over. He's hungry, he's sleepy, fight, 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 the power of friendship is greater than any charyuk in the world. Aside from the occasional moments where the subject of his grandpa, Jin Taejin, gets brought up, anime Mori doesn't really get any more deep than that. This became quickly irritating to me and is easily one of my least favorite things about the anime. While the webtoon's portrayal of him does carry those traits, they're not the only things that define him. The relationship with his grandfather is explored better, the best example being chapter 19 of the webtoon when Mori gets on a call with Taejin. This scene was skipped in the anime. One thing brought up in this chapter is that the Jin family lives by the philosophy of do whatever the hell you want. It's not really expanded upon, at least within the 2 arcs that I read, but it provides a little more context instead of Mori just being a silly character for the sake of being a silly character, like how it is in the anime. Another thing that isn't necessarily cut but isn't explained well in the anime is how Mori came to enter the tournament. All the anime really gives us is that he got his ass kicked by Commissioner R, the blonde one, and that he wants to find his grandpa. This cuts out details like how R was the first person to deliver Mori a loss across 300 fights, and another detail that shows up later that Mori managed to break R's arm during their fight, and R even vouches for Mori by claiming that he's the strongest fighter in the Seoul preliminaries. Going from the webtoon to the anime, Mori is mostly stripped of those bits that makes him more interesting, which leaves him in the shallow, repetitive state that he is in. When we get around to talking about the action, there will be more discussion regarding just how impressive of a fighter Mori actually is. Next up is Han Dewi and Yu Bira, 2 of Mori's friends that act as 2 more main protagonists. Similar to Mori, they also had their acceptance of invitations cut. While wanting to pay for his friend Seungtae's recovery is brought up in the anime, what isn't mentioned is that Dewi also used to be part of a 2-man gang known as the Mad Cow, which had all the other gangs in Gangnam under their thumb. Now, Gangnam is a district within Seoul. There's even a bit where Seungtae gets angry at Dewi for lying about saving money. Eventually, Dewi is invited to the tournament by Commissioner Q. Moving on to Mira, while the anime briefly mentions that Mira loves strong guys, it doesn't actually go into why very well. She is looking for a strong man because her father's dying wish was to, and I quote, find a good seed. Take that as you will, but it provides details nonetheless. She is introduced by having her boyfriend at the time, who is the strongest fighter at her school, get ganged up on and beat down, so she has to take care of business on her own. Commissioner O witnessed this event and perceives her as some kind of monster, and Mira becomes O's vote for the strongest fighter in the Seoul preliminaries. While these details aren't completely necessary for the story, they still provide more background to further build out not just these characters but also how the commissioners view them. While Dewi and Mira within the first 2 arcs are close enough between the 2 versions, there are details that have been cut in the anime that provide additional details to their relationships with various characters. In chapter 74 of the webtoon, Dewi has a training session with Commissioner Q at the mall. In chapters 31 and 32, he receives some insight about Mori from Seungchul, a fighter he beat on his way to their preliminary finals. In chapter 26, Dewi mentions that he's scared of being friends with Mori because Mori reminds him too much of his sick friend Seungtae. In chapter 64, Mira receives a reality check from Commissioner P, which helps her grow stronger by eventually unlocking her charyuk, which is different from the way she unlocks it in the anime. These are not all, but some of the different interactions they have with characters that have been cut, without mentioning those that have been changed between the 2 versions. I'm not going to repeat this whole thing with changed parts, but there is just one I'd like to bring up. In episode 4 of the anime, or chapters 25 through 28 in the webtoon, Mira is approached by a character named Sungjin who asks for her hand in marriage because he secretly wants her sword. She accepts and shenanigans ensue. While the general course of events remains similar between the 2 versions, there are a lot of little differences in terms of both cuts and changes. In the webtoon, Mira's reason for marriage is to pay off her uncle's debts and to revitalize her family's sword style, whereas in the anime only the second reason is mentioned. When Mori confronts Mira in the webtoon with the argument of how winning the competition will grant any wish, Mira counters by saying that they don't know when that's going to be or if they can even trust the commissioners who organized the whole thing. In the anime, Mori says that they've come so far in the tournament to drop out now and that she should marry somebody she actually likes, and all Mira says is that she's getting married to revitalize the sword style. Sungjin is shown to be more pompous in the anime, whereas in the webtoon he's initially a mild-mannered character who eventually becomes very self-centered with a distaste for the poor. There are actually 2 conversations between Sungjin and the uncle. The anime portrays only one. In the anime, the uncle begs Sungjin to call off the marriage, which Mira interrupts. In the webtoon, Mira never shows up to the conversation, and instead, Sungjin's personality changes and basically says the uncle can't do anything to stop the marriage. There's still more, but I think you get the point. The anime is skimping out on all these little details here and there in order to accomplish the bare minimum in telling this episode's story, and I think this is a great example of how the anime is just a hollow, surface-level version of what the webtoon presents. The commissioners are a powerful group of individuals that are responsible for hosting the entire tournament. We've already brought up a few when talking about the 3 main characters. The main difference between the 2 versions regarding them is that most of the interactions commissioners have with one another or other characters have been cut from the anime, whereas in the webtoon it's a recurring thing that adds a little extra to each and every one of them. The only exception in the anime would be Commissioner Q, and that's mostly to make jokes about how he keeps getting salary cuts. Q and R actually have a rivalry that's brought up several times. It can be as petty as R getting a drink while Q is scrounging for money to a full-blown fight in chapter 14 while O is watching from the sidelines. P doesn't like Mori that much because she bet on a fighter named Kang Man-seok to be the strongest candidate from Seoul, and Mori beat him quite handily. In chapter 32, the commissioners are discussing among themselves about who they think will win the preliminary finals, as well as discussing some notable fighters from other provinces. In it, you can not only get a good look at how the commissioners feel about the participants, but also in their dynamics with one another, such as how S keeps poking fun at Q for losing to Mori. These kinds of inclusions give the commissioners a more human feel, which the anime fails to nail down outside of commissioners Q and Shim Bongsa. They simply come off as powerful figures who don't have much else going on outside of being powerful. One of the most disappointing things about the anime was its treatment of the Six. The Six are a group of, 6 incredibly powerful fighters that are appointed to that position by the president. Within the first 2 arcs, we get to directly see 5 of them: Park Mujin, Seo Hanliang, Jeon Jae-san, Na Bong-chim, and Kim Eun-yeol. Similar to the commissioners, most of them are relegated to being mysterious, powerful characters with not a lot going on outside of that. In reality, the webtoon once again portrays more interactions within the group and with other characters to bring additional depth to them. One thing that's brought up by them is the argument of charyuk users versus genuine fighters. Jae-san argues for charyuk, Bong-chim argues for genuine fighting, and Hanliang tells them to get along better. Hanliang manages to swipe some money off of Mori and another character named Pumgwang and messes around with them for the sake of messing around. The reason why Bong-chim is missing an arm is because before the events of the God of High School, the Six fought against Jin Taejin, Mori's grandfather, who not only defeated them but took Bong-chim's arm. The fight also destroys 10% of the Korean territory, and as a result, when Mori meets Bong-chim for the first time, Bong-chim tries to kill him after having been locked up for 17 years. Park Mujin's actual name is Park Mubong, and he seems to get a little sensitive every time somebody calls him by that name. The interaction between Mujin and the Nox Bishop Sang Mandok in the anime is a rather bland conversation. It's much more interesting in the webtoon, with how Mujin blows off one of Mandok's arms as they get into a childish argument about whose name is better, and then they go for a hug and ask how each other has been. They're simultaneously complete bros with each other while working in opposite directions. It's really weird, but it's really enjoyable. The reason why I find the anime's treatment of the Six to be so disappointing is because of Jeon Jae-san, who ended up being my favorite character within the first 2 arcs. In the anime, all that's really said about him after his introduction is that he's the head of a massive company and the grandfather of Jeon Jugok, another fighter we meet during the national tournament. Jugok is matched up against Chegal Tech, a fighter known for having particularly bloody fights, and Jugok is critically injured. After he becomes imbued with a new charyuk, he goes on a rampage throughout the hospital where he is killed off by Tech. When the city of Seoul falls under immense danger as a bishop of the cult Nox attempts to bring their god down upon the city, Jae-san sacrifices himself to defend the city to avenge his grandson. I do want to say that while this is all good stuff, there was one scene that was cut from the webtoon that made me genuinely appreciate this character a lot more. It's in chapter 92 when Jae-san is sitting by what remains of his grandson. Mujin enters the room informing the grieving Jae-san that his company has been taken over by JG Group, which is owned by Tech. Jae-san asks to see the man who killed his grandson. Mujin declines. Jae-san asks again, but with much more force and emotion that causes the security detail in the room to be blasted against the wall and causing parts of the floor and ceiling to crumble. Mujin declines, and as the two are about to get in a fight, Hanliang breaks in to mediate. Mujin explains that Tech can't be brought to Jae-san due to reasons related to the tournament, and Jae-san threatens to destroy the stadium. This is the one scene that I cannot believe was cut between the 2 versions. I found this scene to be incredibly powerful, depicting a man of such status and stature who has lost everything that can't have his one last request granted to him, to see the face of his grandson's killer. It makes his defense of the city of Seoul even more impactful as he has nothing left to lose and puts forth an immense display of his abilities by teleporting away the entire population of Seoul, reassembling a barrage of nuclear missiles into a giant magic bomb, then hammering said bomb into a god by summoning a meteor. In the anime, Jae-san is successful in bringing down the god, but in the webtoon, he is not. This is, by a significant margin, my favorite chapter of the entire webtoon, and I cannot express how disappointed I am that this was not incorporated into the anime. Since we just talked about Jae-san, we should also talk about his grandson Jugok in some additional detail. I think the anime does a very poor job at depicting this character. He simply shows up in episode 7, is defeated, then comes back a few episodes later in 11 as a monster to get defeated again. I had completely forgotten about this character after his reappearance and mistook him for Go Gamdo, a character that appears in episode 2. For the record, Gamdo does not return after his defeat in episode 2, so that goes to show how forgettable Jugok was in the anime if a character that has a similar amount of screen time as him from way back at the start is more memorable. In the webtoon, we get to see some backstory such as Jae-san talking to him when Jugok was a child, or how Jugok had lost in the finals of a competition to another side character named Park Il-pyo, and Jae-san wanting to take Il-pyo in as a student. As a result, Jugok feels that Il-pyo looks down upon him and can't stand that. The most important details that was cut from the webtoon is during his rampage throughout the hospital as a charyuk-possessed monster in chapter 91. He recognizes himself in the mirror, has a flashback to what I presume to be the lowest point of his life, that being his defeat to Il-pyo, then completely loses control of himself as the charyuk takes over and begins to consume everything around itself. The anime contains almost none of this, which contributes to why he was so forgettable to me. As I mentioned, Chugok got his backstory revealed in the webtoon. As far as minor characters are concerned, he's not the only one. As a matter of fact, almost every minor character featured in fights has some semblance of a backstory, or at least they do in the webtoon. The anime made the decision to pick and choose which minor characters will and won't have their backstories brought up. For example, characters such as Go Gamdo, Baek Seung-chul, Kim-gi, and Lee Marin had their backstories entirely removed. Characters like Il-pyo and Seung-ah had parts of their backstory removed, while characters like Pum-gwang and Chang Jang-mi had their backstories altered. Characters hailing from the Gyeongbuk and Gangwon provinces were removed altogether, maybe outside of a shot or two in which they appear. One of my favorite parts about reading the webtoon was how it made minor characters, even if they only appeared for 1 or 2 fights, still feel like actual characters with proper backstories and motivations. Even if many of them aren't mentioned after their elimination from the tournament, at least within the first 2 arcs, they still contributed to making these fights more interesting and brought more life to the tournament. The anime picking and choosing which characters will and won't have backstories featured completely killed off that aspect of the webtoon. I think the only character that was successful in this regard was Jin Pum-gwang, and even then I still found the webtoon's version of him to be better. In the anime, Pum-gwang wants to finish high school at the age of 38 to make up for him not doing so in the past, even if the entrance exam proves to be difficult for him. In the webtoon, this is still true, but it also incorporates him developing his friendship with Changmi and even being arrested on a false accusation, which causes him to miss an entrance exam. As a consequence of this, Changmi's backstory is also built up as well. A lot of the backstories of minor characters in The God of High School are similarly humble and very down-to-earth like Pum-gwang's, and to repeat myself, it was one of my favorite aspects of reading the webtoon. We'll wrap things up for characters here, although some points might be brought back as we move along. The next thing I want to talk about is the action. Something that should be noted is that pretty much every single fight in The God of High School has been changed in some way between the 2 versions. I don't mean things like different dialogue or different moves. Generally, these are more noticeable changes, such as in the tone of the dialogue or in how the fighters interact with one another. We talked about how some character backstories were removed and even some characters that were outright removed completely. Other changes that occur include, but are not limited to, the following examples. Some fights take place in different locations, such as the tussle between Gamdo and Mansuk or the fight between Il-pyo and Taek. Some fights have different results, such as the one between Mori and Il-pyo and the one between Mira and Marin. And as consequences of these different results, some fights in the webtoon don't show up in the anime, such as the one between Mira and Il-pyo or the very short one between Mori and Marin, even though that last one is more like a flex than an actual fight. I'm not going to talk about every single fight, but there are 3 notable ones I would like to go through. The first would be the sole preliminary finals between Mori and Dewi. This would be episode 5 in the anime and chapters 33 through 38 in the webtoon. While the version in the anime is visually incredible, especially in its latter half, there is an important detail that is missing that makes the webtoon's version so great. Baek Seung-chul, the fighter Dewi beat 2 rounds ago, is spectating the fight. Before the preliminary finals, Dewi had requested some help from Seung-chul, who said that while Dewi is a great fighter, the skill disparity between him and Mori is far too great. As a result of this, Dewi had taken the approach of doing anything that he can to win, which involved incorporating new techniques such as Brazilian kicks and dirty boxing, which drew mixed reactions from the crowd. However, that isn't the most important part. The reason why Seung-chul's appearance matters is because he contributes substance to the style in the form of analysis. He's able to note things such as Mori breaking Dewi's defense via centrifugal force, and Mori kicking up dust to absorb some of the impact from Dewi's Azure Dragon move. The greatest bit of analysis he provides is about Dewi's form of the 4 Guardian Gods technique. Thanks to Seung-chul's analysis, we learn that his technique serves 2 purposes. The anime covers one of these. The technique blocks the opponent's hit, unbalances them, breaks their defense, and then finishes them off. The purpose that isn't covered by the anime is that the first 3 steps are used to control and diffuse the airflow, and the final step is used to redirect all of that air to the opponent at once, creating a palm wave to blast them away. This makes Mori's ability to counter it in the webtoon and to emulate it in the Blue Dragon Kick in both versions become much more impressive. The second notable example would be the fight between the Seoul and Jeju teams, and this is where I need to explain a major difference between the national tournament fights across the 2 versions. In the anime, the fights in the national tournament are a best of 3 format. Each fighter can fight in 1 round, and whichever team takes 2 rounds first wins. Simple enough. In the webtoon, the fights are in a best of 5 format. Fighters are not limited to any number of rounds once they enter the ring. If a fighter wins a round, they can either choose to continue fighting or tag out, with tagging out meaning that they can't re-enter the ring. Whichever team knocks out all 3 opposing fighters first wins. For example, if a fighter enters in round 1, they can continue to fight until they are too exhausted, knocked out, or if they manage to take down all 3 opposing fighters in a row. You might already be able to tell that the webtoon structure is more complicated, and while more complicated doesn't always mean better, in this case it leads to some great scenarios that aren't present in the anime, with the greatest example being the fight between Seoul and Jeju. Dewi is not able to participate in this fight. He interrupted a tournament fight before this one, which led to him getting suspended. In the anime, he is suspended for 1 match. In the webtoon, he is suspended for 2. Therefore, this is a 2 versus 3 situation. To make matters worse, Mori had been led elsewhere due to information regarding his grandfather's location, which means that he hasn't shown up to the fight. This leaves Mira alone fighting against potentially the entire Jeju roster. While there are some differences in the round 1 fight between Mira and Marin across the 2 versions, the only one I'm going to highlight is that Mira loses to Marin. The important change is with Mori. Mori is taken away to a derelict factory where he suffers through an explosion, followed by having to fight against Pei Long, a Charyuk user with the ability to create doppelgangers. This proves to be quite the challenge, which pushes Mori to use the pressure point techniques he learned from Na Bongchim, with this specific one negating his ability to feel pain for the next 2 hours. The most important words from all of that are the last few, the next 2 hours. The webtoon keeps a very close eye on the clock from 3:20 to 5:20 PM, where Mori must be able to defeat Pei Long, return to the arena for the tournament, and also fight through all 3 of the Jeju representatives in order to secure a win before he collapses from the damage his body has been through. And he does it all. He barely makes it in time and defeats the final Jeju fighter before his body gives out. There's a tangible tension during it all, with the webtoon constantly flashing the timer to remind the reader that Mori has 24 minutes left, then 9 minutes, then 3, then 0. It's an actual race against the clock that makes Mori's 3-0 sweep so much better. The anime, through its decisions to change the results of the fight between Mira and Marin by having Mira win and neglecting to take the timer into consideration, is lacking in the tension that makes the Seoul vs Jeju fight so great. In the anime, Mori's timer is set to an hour, but this may as well be 1,000 hours because it's never mentioned again, so it may as well not matter. He simply arrives at the arena, shows off a flashy new move, and that's that. It's just missing the tension entirely. The third and final example would be the fight between Seoul and Jeonnam teams. This would be episode 10 for the anime and chapters 76 to 88 in the webtoon. The first big change to note is the dynamic within the Jeonnam team. In the anime, Il-pyo is always rooting for his teammates and they have a lot of respect for him, but outside of that, not much is shown besides some backstory related to Seung-a's sister Seung-yeon. In the webtoon, we get to see some behind-the-scenes training where Il-pyo teaches his teammates Hyunbok and Seung-a the weaknesses of not Mori, but his fighting technique Renewal Taekwondo or Re-Taekwondo. Il-pyo also addresses his teammates by telling him that their skill level isn't enough to be of any help at the national level and that they're coming along to fill the requirements. The best they can do is kill time and exhaust the opponent. These 2 facets of the Jeonnam team combine to form what makes the fight so good. Il-pyo is a very analytical fighter. He likes to study his opponents and prepare specific counters tailor-made for their fighting styles. Mori is no exception. However, 2 components to Mori's techniques that Il-pyo could not crack are Mori's use of pressure points and his blue dragon kicks. So he employs Hyunbok and Seung-a to disable these 2 techniques and eliminate them from the equation. Hyunbok damages the finger that Mori uses for his points, and Seung-a disorients him to hinder his ability to execute kicks. This fight isn't the 1v1 between Mori and Il-pyo that the anime portrays it to be. It's rather a 1v3 between Mori and the entire Jeonnam team. Each member serves a specific role in overcoming Mori. And even with this, Mori puts up one hell of a fight against Il-pyo and only loses after Il-pyo unleashes his fox form. And Mori loses quite unceremoniously, mind you. There's no fancy lightning and storm clouds and big fucking hurricanes. He just gets kicked around and then Mita has to step in. The webtoon does an incredible job in portraying a true underdog fight, since Mita is clearly stated to be the weakest of the Seoul trio, and we just saw how easily Il-pyo in his fox form defeated Mori. And remember how I said Dewi was suspended for 2 matches? Well, this is that second match, so the stakes are even higher since Mita becomes the team's last hope. The fact that this fight between Mita and Il-pyo didn't make the cut when going from the webtoon to the anime genuinely baffles me. I guess Mori just isn't allowed to lose in the anime unless it's a joke, like how he messed up his pressure points that one time. Gosh, as an anime, Mori just... so silly, man. I'm not going to talk much more about the fights since I want to do a final rundown of a few more things that were skipped or changed before wrapping this video up, but I think those 3 fights exemplified what I said at the start of the video, that the God of High School's anime adaptation understands what made the webtoon great on a surface level but failed to see anything past it. It captures the fantastic action and arguably improves upon it since some of the fights in the anime are visually phenomenal, but it's lacking the finer details that provide so much more context and background that enhances these fights in a way that a visual upgrade can't achieve. The anime didn't fail to read between the lines, it basically skipped every other line instead. Speaking of skipped, here's a few more things that were skipped from the webtoon. In chapter 69, after the Jeju fight, the final 3rd fighter turns his 2 fellow imposters into bombs. In the same chapter, he's also taken away by Mujin and Commissioner P for interrogation. In chapters 101 and 102, Dewi fights against Bora and then Tech all by himself, although Mori does come to join after a while. In episode 59, some of the spectators begin gossiping about the best fighters, which eventually devolves into some hilariously outlandish speculation about how Mori places his sleeping mask on the eyes of his victims. While the anime shows this a bit with the greed charyok, Tech is shown to be able to absorb the charyok of the people his megalodon devours. This includes Peilong's doppelgangers, Jugok's mage, and many more. There's a clear shot of this in chapter 95. In chapter 19, there's a raid on Jin Taejin's home where Taejin promptly wipes out the entire squadron for wearing shoes indoors. Going from the preliminary tournament to the national tournament, we go from teams of 1 to teams of 3. The reasoning for this is different between the two versions. In the anime, it's to allow more candidates that could be the key, an object that grants the human holder the ability to hurt a god. In the webtoon, both fighters and candidates from around the nation are being attacked and killed off, so the number is increased because the fighters would be safer in a group. Something in a similar vein is how Mori is led to the factory where a false copy of his grandpa is held. In the anime, he simply receives a note at his doorstep. In the webtoon, a Jeju fighter that was held prisoner by the player assassins at the same factory manages to escape and bring Mori to the site. When it comes to the divine pellet, Mujin gives one to Mori even though Mori is unaware of what it exactly is. In the webtoon, Mori is hungry late at night, wanders into Bongchim's containment cell and just digs one out of a drawer. These are some of the changes between the two versions that ultimately don't matter, but the last two are a result of that infamously fast pacing. The anime's versions of those events are much shorter compared to the webtoons, to compensate for how much faster everything else around it is. In episode 12 and chapter 98 of the anime and webtoon respectively, the characters are transported to a mysterious forest. In the anime, they are simply teleported there, then teleported out after a while once it's convenient to do so. In the webtoon, Mujin collapses the arena floor, which reveals the forest underneath. Those who fell eventually climb back out via a staircase. I think the webtoon's version of this is much better in two ways. Number 1, it does a great job in establishing some suspense as to why there's this giant forest underneath the city of Seoul. Number 2, one of the last things to happen in the national tournament is that a character named Bora stumbles upon a door in this forest leading to Kim Ungnya, the member of the Six who has the ability to grant the wish. By directly establishing where the forest is in relation to Seoul, both Bora and Ungnya appearing at the surface makes some sense. In the anime, Bora is just shown to be wandering around wherever the fuck she is, and she happens to run into Ungya's door. While the webtoon provides an explanation for it without having to spend too much time, the anime makes it feel more like an afterthought that was tacked on at the end. The best way for me to describe the God of High School's anime adaptation is that it feels like a fights and funny moments compilation of the original webtoon. It's got all the exciting action and comedy while skipping all of the supposedly boring background and context. We're jumping from one thrilling plot point to another, but who cares if any of that's developed? It's gotta make sure you're never gonna be bored, so here's another guy beating the crap out of someone. Why is he fighting? That doesn't matter, because this character's never gonna appear again anyways. In my humble opinion, because who the fuck am I anyways, this was only half of an adaptation. I think the work done by Studio Mappa to make some of the fights look outstanding is what barely saves this adaptation. But even that shiny coat of paint isn't enough to cover up everything that's missing from this. And as I write this sentence to finish this video, there's only one thought that stuck with me. This could have been so much better. Okay, as always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. This video is different from the usual kind of stuff I do. I don't typically look at source materials, and I prefer judging animes as their own standalone things, but I think it was necessary for this one. It was fun, but I'm unsure if I'll do these kinds of videos more often because it ended up being a bigger time sink than I anticipated. It took too long. The script was also far less structured than usual, and I had to wing most of it as well. I don't know how much of that is sort of noticeable, but yeah, that's the reality of the situation. The next video may or may not take a while. If it looks like it'll take a while, then I'll probably make a short one on something else before returning to it. That should be everything from me. If you want to check out some of my other stuff, there should be links on the screen right now to check out some of my other content. But outside of that, yeah, once again, thanks for watching, and take care.